All right. Hello there. Hi, everyone. My name is Annabelle Huang. I am the managing partner of Amber Group, a global crypto market maker and digital asset manager. Today, we have a fireside chat titled The Rise of On-Chain Crypto Derivatives, How Synthetix is Staying Ahead of Competition. And I'm very honored to be joined by founder of Synthetix, Kain Warwick, today to have with us. So please go ahead and maybe introduce yourself and the product.
Hey, Annabelle. Yeah, thanks. Excited to be here. So Synthetix, as the title kind of describes, is an on-chain derivatives platform. We allow people to predominantly trade assets that they wouldn't otherwise be able to trade on Ethereum. We have perpetual futures for Bitcoin, all the way through to a bunch of different assets. Most recently, Pepe, which I'm sure everyone will be very excited about. It's essentially a derivatives platform as you would see on a centralized exchange like a BitMEX or a Binance or OKX or anything like that.
Nice. I guess now we're talking about synthetic assets. What are the advantages of synthetic assets, and why is it essential to have them on chain and not just Ethereum? Also on the other layer twos or potentially multi-chain world.
So I think there's a tension between where you can deploy something like a derivatives protocol. Right now, you need some kind of scaling solution. You could go to an all compared to Ethereum, right? Ethereum mainnet doesn't really support the level of activity that's required, both throughput and latency for a derivatives trading platform. You can do spot trading there using AMMs like Uniswap, obviously, and others. But once you get to derivatives, it just gets a little bit harder. Most of the derivatives platforms have chosen to go to some form of scaling solution. So that might be an Alt-L1, it could be Solana, it could be Avalanche, it could be an Alt-L2, like a layer 2 solution, like Optimism, Arbitrum. DYDX chose Starkware at first, which was quite a good decision, I think, in hindsight.
Now Cosmos.
Now Cosmos, exactly. Yeah. But I think for that scaling up section, that they needed to do that early period, I think the decision to go with Starkware was quite a good choice. So all of these derivatives platforms need something like that if they're going to be on chain. The alternative, obviously, is to run it via a centralized exchange. So BitMEX that was the platform that invented this perpetual future contract style of trading. So, basically a futures product that doesn't expire. And I think that is something that within crypto markets is, a genuine innovation. And it has allowed for a lot of different, products to be kind of created based on that. Synthetix is based on that perpetual future product that BitMEX, created, I guess, almost 10 years ago now. That's kind of the competition, right? Most of the derivatives volumes are on centralized exchanges. That's where these perpetual futures were invented. And you've got a bunch of different derivatives platforms that are trying to compete with those centralized exchanges on chain. And they've had to kind of pick and choose where they want to go and where they want to live based on a bunch of trade-offs. But the idea is obviously that, we want eventually all trading activity to be on chain. And, we don't want people to have to custody their funds with a centralized exchange for very obvious reasons, more and more obvious over time.
Yeah, actually, I guess speaking of, the history of also the evolution of not just the centralized, the CeFi market, also within the DeFi market, let's maybe go back to the beginning of the DeFi summer. And Synthetix was one of the first pioneers of the liquid mining program as well. So maybe can also walk us through how that came about, and then we can go maybe into a little bit of all the developments that you guys have done since then.
Yeah, so I think I talked a little bit about DYDX, and I think that some of the decisions that Synthetix made versus say what DYDX shows are fairly illustrative of the challenges and trade-offs that we have. DeFi Summer blew up, I think, for a number of reasons. I think that we finally had a sort of network effect of all of these different protocols that were deployed, working. You could do different things. You could do lending. You could do trading. You had all of these different kind of primitives that had popped up, and you had variations on. You didn't just have one lending protocol. You had Compound and Aave, and all kinds of other longer tail lending platforms. Same thing with trading. So the interesting thing was DeFi Summer kind of came about because you had these incentives, plus you had all these platforms, and you had the ability to not just move between the platforms, but also combine them. And, this composability, as we call it, right? The ability to kind of permissionlessly connect these different protocols and move between them is what I think created that, the kind of critical mass to blow up DeFi Summer and have people get really excited about it. And that was all happening on L1 or on Ethereum mainnet. And then, what we realized pretty rapidly is, as cool as all of that stuff was, mainnet couldn't actually support it. And so, when I think one of the first times when, things became really obvious that this is not going to be viable was like March 2020, the, COVID crash. We just saw gas prices spike so crazily. And, everyone kind of looked around and was like, oh, this is not going to work. And at that point, obviously, there'd been a long history of, development and engineering effort towards scaling Ethereum. But that was kind of the catalyst where everyone was like, all right, we really need to do this. The alternative, obviously, was to move away from something that allowed for composability, for, all of these different protocols to live on a single chain, and to kind of move into your own chain and go to your own silo. So that's what DYDX chose to do. They went to their own instance of, and now they've done the same thing with Cosmos. They're, so this app chain. What became the app chain thesis? I think, DYDX was one of the first people to really kind of nail that and make it work and scale it up. And that fundamentally is the tension, as I see it, right? Is this idea of going to a siloed place which can scale, or trying to scale something where everyone can live in the same place and you maintain that composability.
No, that's a good point. I think DYDX, I think they probably look at their competitors more so in the CeFi realm, right? I think they're benchmarking against Binance and all the other centralized exchanges, as opposed to maybe a lot of the DeFi or on-chain native solutions. So I guess on that end, maybe you can talk a little bit about how Synthetix is leading the way in terms of the DeFi side, and how do you think it compares with your competitors? And I guess, who do you think are your main competitors in this space, really?
So, I think this is, again, I come back to like DYDX. I think they got it right. I think that they rightly saw, and I put this down to Antonio a lot, right? He rightly saw that where we were at the time when they launched on Starkware, which I guess must have been like late 2020 or maybe early 2021. I can't remember exactly when it was, but when they launched on Starkware, they made a decision that composability was not really that valuable, because we didn't even really have, L2s that could support this stuff, right? So better to go on your own chain that could do the thing than to wait for something that would maintain composability. And as you point out, rightly so, they were trying to compete with Binance, OKEx, BitMEX, and all of those exchanges are also siloed, right? And they have advantages like usernames and passwords, right? You just turn up and, you put your username and password in and you can trade. Obviously, you got to get some crypto into them. You probably from another exchange for most people, right? They just, withdraw from one exchange, from BitMEX into Binance or Binance into BitMEX or whatever. And I think that DYDX made that process much easier. And then they got some other things right around, incentives with tokens and all kinds of stuff, and that allowed them to scale up. So I think DYDX right now is the leader in terms of volume, in terms of, a bunch of different metrics that you would track. But for all of us, whether you're a pure DeFi derivatives platform, or you're more of a hybrid like DYDX, I think ultimately we're all aiming for that CeFi volume. We want to take that CeFi volume in the same way that Uniswap has taken a big chunk of the CeFi volume from spot trading. So that's ultimately the goal. And so I think that, right now, based on, I don't know, we're doing like $1 billion a day collectively, or like maybe a couple of $1 billion a day collectively in the DeFi realm. And on the day that I looked, like last week at some point, I think, Binance had done $30 billion that day, just Binance, right? So, we're still a very, very tiny fraction. There's a lot of room for us to grow, into that. But the way that we do that is going to have to bridge that gap. And again, I come back to DYDX. I think they did a really good job of this, of bridging the gap for a user in terms of the onboarding process to get them in. It's no question that being non-custodial is beneficial, but if there's a huge amount of trade-offs for a user, they're probably going to go with the custodial solution. So we need to get the trade-offs as small as possible, and then we need to make the onboarding process as simple as possible. And we're getting closer, but we're not quite there yet, I don't think.
Yeah, it's true. But I remember a lot of the same arguments was made for Uniswap and how it's never going to catch up with the CeFi liquidity, right? But, I think a lot of the ways that has surprised us. And before Amber was actually with AirSwap. So we were trying to target the exact same problems, right? So maybe in a different manner, but I think we should not underestimate what a lot of the on-chain innovation can eventually lead to in terms of user onboarding and trading volume, et cetera. And speaking of product innovation and updates, you guys have also done a lot since the liquidity mining program. You've launched Perp. You also have Synthetix v3, added support for optimism as well. So maybe can also walk us through a little bit of the new product features and also the future roadmap here.
Yeah, so I think all of this in my mind kind of converges on one place, right? And that place is basically that if you're going to take volume from CeFi, you need to look at the CeFi playbook. And we have a very clear playbook that's played out over almost every single cycle, right? If you look at the dominant 2 or 3 exchanges in every cycle, when you get to the top, right? Those exchanges moved faster in some dimension that users really cared about, right? And so we can take Binance as a really good example, right? So Binance moved faster than everyone in terms of listing ICO tokens, right? And so even if you were, let's say, a Kraken user, right, or a Coinbase user or whatever, you would go into the latest ICO, or you would somehow acquire those tokens or whatever. You might trade them on either Delta or some crazy place, right? And now you've got all these tokens and you're like, oh, what am I going to do with them? Where can I go to trade where I feel comfortable? You log into Coinbase and nope, they don't have, whatever that crazy thing is that you just bought, right? Civic, let's say, right? And you're sitting there and you're like, oh man, I really want to, dump this thing, or I want to trade it, or I want to buy more, or whatever your thing is. And then 20 minutes later, you see a tweet from CZ and he's like, guess what? You can trade Civic here, right? And you're like, okay, cool. And so then you go to Binance and you trade it and you're like, oh, this isn't too bad or whatever. And then maybe you go back to your old exchange because you want to trade BTC and ETH and maybe there's a bit more liquidity, but then a week later there's some other token, and so eventually you just find yourself going back to Binance more and more and more as the place that you want to trade, because that's the thing that is exciting, or that's the thing that you've got, or whatever it is, right? And so I think the reason why Binance won was basically that. Right. And then if you look at last cycle, FTX had a very similar playbook, although they obviously added things like leverage, which, users really wanted. Right. And so they gave people the ability to trade on margin, and they gave people higher leverage, and they had more perps markets and all of these things. And I think the closest we've come in DeFi to this playbook is Uniswap, because Uniswap now, whatever the asset is, almost invariably, Uniswap is the first place where it has liquidity, right? Uniswap is, because it's permissionless, it's faster than any CeFi exchange can hope to be, really, right? I think even for tokens where the CeFi exchange launches it, Uniswap's got it like, within 10 seconds, right? It's there. And so what we need to think about as DeFi platforms is, how do we replicate that? both the way that Uniswap has done that for spot trading, but also, the way that CeFi exchanges have done it, cannibalizing it, right? And the only way to do that is permissionless trading. We have to allow for permissionless pools and permissionless markets. The issue with Synthetix, historically has been that because everyone is trading against the LPs, right? The LPs are the counterparties, the people who stake SNX are the counterparties. We have to be very careful what we list. We can't just list anything, and we certainly can't have permissionless markets. What V3 does is allows us to sort of carve off all of the higher quality assets, let's say, right? More liquidity, and then let the long tail stuff be permissionless. And so you have deep liquidity for things like BTC, ETH, gold, oil and commodities and Forex and all that sort of stuff. And then for Pepe on day one, when it launches, you might have a little bit less liquidity, but it's there, right? You don't have to wait 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks for it to get listed. And so I think that's the way that we're going to be able to capture much more attention, because absent that, there isn't a huge reason for people to jump onto your exchange. But when every time you turn up and say, oh, I want to trade Pepe, and then it's Frog, and then it's, whatever the 10th derivative of that is, and it's always there, and it's always tradable, and there's always leverage, and there's always all these things that you want, then eventually you're going to keep coming back there, and you're like, oh, this is actually the place that I like to trade, and now you might trade ETH and BTC there. So that, for us, is what we see as the huge advantage of Synthetix v3. And then in perps, I think the benefit is, and it took us a long time to get there, right? This was not an easy process to go through, but perps v2, the latest version of perps, finally has a mechanism whereby the debt pool, all of the synthetic stakers, right, that are the counterparties to the trades, is very neutral. And we have a mechanism that we use to basically keep that in line, so that if someone takes a big position long Bitcoin, people are encouraged to come in and arbitrage that to short Bitcoin and to rebalance and to keep the skew in line. And so what you have is much lower risk for stakers, which means you increase the liquidity that's available for traders. And then you have a longer tail of assets that people can access much, much more quickly. And I think that those are kind of some of the necessary conditions to really bring people in and get them trading on the exchange and make it worthwhile for them to bridge to optimism, or to bridge away from mainnet, or to make that leap off a centralized exchange onto DeFi, in the same way that Uniswap managed to get people to go and trade on Ethereum, as opposed to trading on Bitfinex.
Yeah, no, we do think that Uniswap has really solved the long tail asset, right? So because us as a market maker, it's very difficult to just jump in and start providing liquidity and making markets on all these new tokens that come to the market. But the AMM model solves that. But if we do compare, the majority of the trading volume is still happening on the major tokens. And I guess Synthetix can also bring in a lot of the largely traded commodities or the other real world assets to bridge that on chain and to be one of the blue chip assets to be traded. So to your point, solving the majority of the liquidity, but while allowing that long tail access could be a very unique positioning. So yeah, that's very exciting. Do you have any projects that are being built on top of Synthetix v3 that you're personally very excited about?
So we have a number of people that have already integrated Synthetix, the existing version. So we have options being built on there. We have vaults. We have a bunch of different front ends that are building, Quenta, Polynomial, that are building on top of perps to make it accessible, because Synthetix is now the liquidity layer. It doesn't actually do the front end kind of user facing interface work. We let other people come in and do that. Other projects do that and do the integrations. So that's already happening. I think the thing that makes it challenging for let's say you're a front end, let's say you're Quenta, right? And you're a front end for perps. You've got a bunch of users, and users saying, hey, I want to trade Pepe. right? And you're like, we got to wait for, the protocol that provides the liquidity to do that, right? And that can be quite frustrating, to be in that position where your users are demanding something you kind of can't give it. And that's where I think that permissionlessness, to allow for permissionless markets, as soon as the user demand for something arrives, then, that user demand can be satisfied. And I think that will really shift things. Obviously, that means that, Quenta needs to integrate, new versions of perps and Synthetix v3. But fundamentally, the majority of the things that are happening in Synthetix v3 are making the overall system more efficient. They're really not changing huge structural things. It's increasing efficiency. There's a couple of big things around like additional collateral types and some stuff like that. Allowing more liquidity for the stablecoin SUSD. But the majority of it is basically taking everything we've learned over the last 5 years and rewriting it from scratch to be much more efficient.
Well, I guess it's a good segue in our last topic, which is, what's next? What else are you guys working on? Is it the cross-chain functionality? Is it to keep iterating on Synthetix or the perps feature, or inviting more projects to be built on top of what you guys already have done? And obviously you, I think 2 days ago, right, before this panel, you actually put out a short blog post about what comes next. And I wanted to see what you have in mind and how you really envision the next iteration of this to be. And I think you touch upon SNX staking or even potential buyback, right? I think a lot of the token holders are quite keen to hear about your thoughts.
So, we're lucky we have this governance body called the Treasury Council. And the Treasury Council has discretion over the Treasury. And so it is the governance body that is probably best positioned to do experimental things, right? Try things out. It's got funds, it can try something out, it can do an experiment, and if it doesn't work, no big deal. It doesn't need to be, coded into the protocol for something to happen, right? So a good example of this is passive staking. And one thing that I think that Synthetix, has done very well over the years is learn from other, protocols in the space and see, observe what's happening. The people in the community are very connected to other protocols. Sometimes they're in governance, sometimes they're founders of other protocols. There's a deep connectivity between Synthetix and the rest of the ecosystem. And so when cool stuff is happening, like, V curve or, things like, the new balancer pools, when they launch, people will turn up and they'll be like, hey guys, have you seen this? What do you think? And, a debate will kind of play out over, is this something that could be useful for Synthetix? And I think
I guess I do have to say that, I also tried to do the SNX staking. And even for me, it was a bit complicated, right?
It's painful. It's a painful process. Yeah.
And I don't know what risk I'm exposing myself to, how to hedge it. So yeah.
It's definitely not for the faint of heart. And I think the diehards who've been staking for a long time, even myself, right? Like I would say I've probably incurred, more pain over the last 5 years from staking than in any other aspect of, crypto that I've participated in. So, it's definitely not an easy thing to do. It's obviously gotten better as we've improved the protocol and, as we've reduced risk. But the early days, the risk to a staker was just astronomical, right? So I think one of the things that I've proposed in that blog post is to make an easy mode staking, right? And the reality is that there are a number of protocols like GMX, which is a competitor protocol, that just have easier versions of staking that you're not the counterparty. They kind of split out these things. And there's other protocols that have done this as well, where they've got like, stake the token and get some, governance rights plus some value capture, and then act as an LP. This is not a new thing, splitting those two functions out. We've always had them joined. And so the idea is, okay, what if we tease this out a little bit and see what would it look like if you just staked SNX and you got some fee yield, right? And again, we don't need to put this into the protocol immediately. We can pay for this experiment out of the treasury and just test it and see, are people willing to stake SNX sort of passively without taking that risk to get a smaller yield. And then when they look next door and they see other people staking SNX and taking the higher risk and getting the higher yield, they go, that's interesting. Maybe I'll give that a try. As opposed to just thinking, no, staking is not for me at all, right? So finding that middle ground. So I think things like that are opportunities for us to just tweak the model a little bit and learn from the rest of the ecosystem and see what works.
No, that makes sense. Or having some sort of the gateway product
Exactly.
that encourage more usage, and then you can have the more advanced or the pro versions of everything else that you can do. I think we only have maybe less than a minute left on this fireside chat, but want to give you for the rest of the floor, rest of the time, and see if you want to anything else that you want to touch upon, and anything else that excites you about the future of DeFi, Synthetix in general.
I think the opportunity that we have today as DeFi, right, is we have scaling, we have multiple different scaling models that are out there, and we have multiple different experiments in almost every single protocol type, whether it's lending or trading or whatever it is, right? Are experimenting on these different scaling solutions. That is a piece of the puzzle, which is now, I think, somewhat solved, right? We're still missing another piece of the puzzle, which is the onboarding friction and kind of, usability. There will, Uniswap has proven that people will, if the incentives are sufficiently high, people will make the leap. They'll learn how to use wallets. They'll learn how to do all of this stuff, and they will start participating on chain. But there's no question that the vast majority of people are still living on centralized exchanges, right? They're still over there. And so I think for DeFi, the real question is, how do we bridge that usability gap? And I think that now that we've solved scaling to an extent, that's really the next question. And there's a lot of smart people working on it, whether it's smart wallets or account abstraction or whatever latest thing you want to call it. But I do think we need to get to that point. And if we can get to that point where we're feature parity with CeFi, CeFi is proving for itself why we shouldn't use CeFi. We don't even need to go there. We don't even need to have that conversation. We just need to be here, safer, easier, more features, et cetera. And I think people will figure it out in the next cycle, and we'll have a lot more DeFi adoption.
Well said. And I guess it's upon actually all of us, right, to keep working on that onboarding, keep simplifying experiences, and
exactly.
on to mass adoption. So with that, that concludes our session today. And thank you all for your time.
Thanks, Annabelle. Appreciate it.